Today, we were undertaking, well, a critical mission, really. We're looking deep into the sources that detail the consequences of these recent, highly protectionist U.S. trade strategies.
Yeah.
Our listener, that's you, wants a clear, comprehensive understanding of how these tariffs are reshaping North America. And what we found in the source material, covering everything from new industrial policy, heated parliamentary debates, right through to massive resource projects, it's truly unexpected.
It really forces a complete reassessment, doesn't it? For decades, the whole story around Canadian trade was, well, one of deference to the massive U.S. market.
Right.
So when the tariffs hit, the immediate expectation in Washington and maybe even in Ottawa was that Canada would just, absorb the blow or get into some long, painful negotiation for exemptions.
But that's not really what the data is showing us, is it?
Not at all. The core theme emerging from our analysis is this really shocking counter-narrative, almost like a geopolitical judo flip, you could say. The real shocker for Washington isn't that Canada fought back. It's that, as one analyst put it, Canada didn't need to fight at all. It simply grew stronger. They actually used that external pressure as the catalyst for internal, pretty fundamental economic restructuring.
That is a fascinating shift, a real change in mindset. So let's unpack this claim of strength. It sounds like it goes way beyond just, emergency economic aid. What specific strategy allowed them to not just weather the storm, but actually use the storm's energy to, well, fuel their own growth?
It was a disciplined and remarkably swift pivot to a three-pillar industrial strategy. You can think of it as a blueprint for kind of accelerated economic independence.
Okay.
So Pillar 1 was to protect the vulnerable domestic sectors.
Yeah.
Pillar 2 was about creating new national champions and scaling up strategic industries. And Pillar 3 was focused on attracting global capital by offering political and regulatory stability. This plan, it actively turns decades of reliance on just exporting raw resources south into a whole new model of value chain integration. And it was all accelerated by the very tariffs that were meant to slow them down.
So instead of just waiting for some trade deal to save them, they decided to literally dig their heels in.
Let's jump straight into the bedrock evidence then, the proof that this strategy is more than just talk.
Yeah, if you want that immediate visible proof that Canada is serious about, achieving economic self-reliance, you don't really look at the political statements. You look at the physical reality on the ground. Specifically, we're looking at a site near Ratner in east central Saskatchewan, the Michelvena Bay Copper Mine Project. This isn't just a promise on paper. This is a tangible billion-dollar commitment being built right into the Canadian Shield.
And this project is hugely significant nationally, not just regionally. It represents Saskatchewan's first new copper mine in, over 30 years?
30 years, yeah.
And to underscore the confidence Ottawa and the private sector have in this strategic pivot, the scale is just massive. A combined private and public investment of $1.18 billion SAD.
Wow.
And they are moving with real speed. Construction is already 60% complete. This is the difference, between drafting policy and actually pouring concrete.
To put that investment figure in context for you, $1.18 billion CAD, that's just a colossal injection into a regional economy.
Yeah.
That figure alone, it represents more capital expenditure on a single mining project than Saskatchewan saw in the entire previous 5 years combined, at least in the base metal sector.
That's right.
The mine's set to begin production mid-2026, aiming for, a staggering output of up to 4,900 tons per day. Mostly copper, but also essential co-products like zinc, gold, silver, over an anticipated 18-year lifespan. It's a generational project, really.
And what's fascinating here is the strategic context of copper itself. Copper is just non-negotiable for the modern economy. It's the silent backbone. Every single electric vehicle, every advanced defense system, every AI data center, all the new renewable energy infrastructure, it requires vast quantities of copper. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, predicts global copper demand will basically quadruple by 2040.
Quadruple. That's huge.
It is. This isn't just a commodity anymore. It's the new strategic resource that really determines who leads the energy transition.
But there was a weakness here, wasn't there? One that the tariffs kind of exposed. Canada's always been known for resources, but its capacity, especially in copper, was slipping.
Absolutely. Even with this spiking global demand, Canada's actual copper output had fallen by about 25% over the past decade.
Hmm.
That decline left Canada quite vulnerable right as the trade war intensified. So, by placing McIlvenna Bay among its top 5 nation-building projects, Ottawa is explicitly making copper a cornerstone of its economic sovereignty strategy.
Economic sovereignty.
Yeah, policy experts are now defining this push as mineral sovereignty, basically. The ability to control the supply, the refinement, and the distribution of essential industrial materials without, external coercion.
And the government intervention here sounds pretty deep. It's not just a handshake deal, it's active fast-tracking, right?
Precisely. This project was immediately assigned to that new Major Projects Office in Calgary, which was specifically designed to cut through bureaucratic red tape.
Uh,
Furthermore, the provincial government in Saskatchewan is heavily incentivizing this. There's a $70 million investment tax credit, for example, and they're modernizing the operation too, requiring the use of an underground battery electric vehicle fleet to cut emissions, powering the site through the clean, reliable Island Falls hydro network.
so it's not just about digging stuff out of the ground.
No, exactly. It's about building a sustainable, modern foundation, which, by the way, increases its long-term appeal to those risk-averse global investors.
Now, if we connect this development back to the bigger picture, this kind of strategic resource security must give Canada immense leverage, mustn't it? Especially looking ahead to that crucial 2026 USNCA review.
It absolutely does. For the listener who needs context, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USNCA, has this mandatory 6-year review clause coming up in 2026.
Right.
This review is a major political checkpoint. Any of the 3 countries can trigger renegotiations or even think about withdrawing. So by establishing this mineral sovereignty now, Canada is basically proving to its southern partner that it can manage and secure critical supply chains independently.
They're strengthening their hand.
Exactly. They're strengthening their negotiating hand by showing they can walk away or at least survive the threat of tariffs because they have diversified routes and secure supplies like McIlvenna Bay coming online.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I think the direct policy backfire. The U.S. slapped that massive 50% import duty on refined copper products, right?
Yeah.
Ostensibly to protect their own domestic industry. That protective measure was supposed to hurt Canadian exports, but it actually seems to have created an opportunity instead.
It was a perfect storm of unintended consequences, really. The U.S. domestic mines already supply less than half of what their manufacturers demand. They're hugely import dependent.
Right.
So the tariffs made Canadian refined copper prohibitively expensive for U.S. buyers. But McIlvenna Bay, notably, will ship concentrates, that's less refined material, to smelters serving Europe and Asia.
Ah, so they bypassed the U.S. market for that specific product.
Precisely. This leverage is key. The U.S. tariffs, intended to secure U.S. supply chains, actually choked them, forcing global buyers to look elsewhere. McIlvenna Bay capitalizes on that global supply shortage that was created, at least in part, by Washington's own policy.
So instead of begging for access to the U.S. market, Canada is actively strengthening its resource network towards global partners. But that requires massive logistical shifts, surely. They can't just ship heavy concentrate across the prairies without a plan.
That's the unseen component, yeah. Shifting exports from south to east and west required immediate investments in port capacity, particularly in Vancouver and Halifax, and securing new rail contracts.
Okay.
The sources show significant state-backed funding going into rail infrastructure upgrades, specifically connecting the prairies directly to those global shipping hubs. The tariffs didn't just push the material out, they forced Canada to rapidly modernize its internal infrastructure, making it structurally less dependent on U.S. transportation networks. Its independence buried in the rock, you could say, and backed by rail, just as the policy demands.
So McIlvenna Bay is the symbol, the concrete example.
Yeah.
But we need to see the blueprint behind it all. Days after Prime Minister Mark Carney's meeting with the U.S. president, where reportedly very little tariff relief was granted, Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced this new declaration in Toronto.
Right.
This seems like the moment the national plan moved from theory to, well, disciplined execution.
Yeah.
The goal, rebuild the economic foundation from within, without waiting for permission or relief from Washington.
This really is the official pivot point. For decades, Canada was characterized by caution, often relying heavily on foreign direct investment and that free trade access. Joly's plan was a stark departure. It signaled that Canada would move forward regardless of whether the U.S. attempted, economic deceleration. This 3-pillar strategy is now essentially the operating system for restructuring the entire national economy.
Let's start with Pillar 1 then. Protect, which the government apparently internally calls the shield. This is the immediate stabilization effort for those Canadian industries hit hardest by U.S. duties. Steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and, as we've discussed, copper.
And they back that protection with serious financial muscle, too. They establish a $5 billion strategic response fund.
$5 billion.
Yeah. And this fund isn't primarily direct handouts, you should know. The sources specify it acts mostly as subsidized loans and strategic loan guarantees. It specifically targets capital investment in modernization, diversification, and automation within these distressed sectors.
So it's about providing liquidity while pushing for competitiveness.
Exactly. Provide the liquidity, but force long-term improvements in competitiveness at the same time.
But the most profound element of Pillar 1 seems to be this Buy Canadian framework. We read that this turns what was maybe a guideline into a legal obligation. How did that specifically happen? What are the legal teeth here?
Well, this involved significant parliamentary action,
Yep.
specifically through amendments to existing procurement and national defense legislation. Previously, Buy Canadian was, let's say, a strong preference, but it could easily be bypassed by trade agreements.
Okay.
The new framework mandates that federal procurement, we're talking defense contracts, massive housing initiatives, big infrastructure projects, must legally prioritize domestic suppliers unless it can be definitively proven that the domestic capability simply does not exist.
Wow.
This effectively creates a massive captive domestic market. It acts as an anchor for industries like steel and aluminum that really need predictable demand to survive those external tariff shocks.
And that domestic demand mandate is already showing results in some key case studies. Tell us about Aloma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie.
Right, Aloma Steel. They used to pretty much live and die by contracts from U.S. automakers. When the auto tariffs hit, they were basically on life support. But because of this Buy Canadian framework, Aloma has secured new long-term orders from Halifax and Vancouver shipyards. These are tied to the country's multi-billion-dollar naval expansion program. That's foundational security for them.
Okay.
Similarly, look at Alouette Aluminum in Quebec. They face crippling U.S. duties, but have now shifted over half of their exports to European markets since spring 2025. The tariff intended to isolate Canadian producers. It instead forced them to become more robust and, crucially, less reliant on a single volatile customer.
I have to jump in here and ask about the auto sector, though. The source material notes a really critical policy choice, the pause in the federal EV mandate. Canada was supposed to have 20% of new light-duty vehicles be electric by 2026. Isn't pausing that mandate basically sacrificing long-term climate goals for short-term trade relief?
That raises an extremely important question, yeah. And it speaks to the difficult trade-offs that are inherent in Pillar 1. Yes, the pause is a clear strategic retreat on an ambitious climate target, no doubt about it.
Right.
But the sources strongly suggest the government viewed it as an economic necessity, not really a choice. Auto sales had already plummeted 35% year over year back in June. Imposing the EV mandate simultaneously with the tariff threat probably would have crushed manufacturers who were already struggling with those expensive cross-border component costs.
So it was about survival first.
Essentially, yes.
No.
The pause, which apparently shifts the target back 2 years, is intended to give manufacturers breathing room. Time to retool supply chains, secure their Canadian assembly plants, ensure those jobs remain long-term, even if the transition to EVs is temporarily a bit slower.
And this support extends beyond manufacturing into the primary sector, too, affecting farmers.
Absolutely. The government committed $370 million in incentives specifically for canola growers. These growers were facing retaliatory duties from China, which made exports really difficult. So the incentive package encourages them to pivot their crops into biofuels, specifically for the domestic Canadian market. Again, you see the theme, domestic absorption and resilience. Taking an exposed export commodity and integrating it into the shielded Buy Canadian domestic energy supply chain.
Okay, let's move to Pillar 2, create. If Pillar 1 is about defending the current economy, Pillar 2 seems to be about accelerating industrial transformation and building up those national champions.
Exactly. The focus here is using that trade pressure to force growth in advanced sectors, particularly defense and high-tech. The new defense strategy is critical here. Heavy investment is going into national security manufacturing, everything from submarines and Arctic patrol vessels to satellites and AI platforms.
Okay.
But what's really strategic is the insistence on technology transfer.
Tell us more about that requirement. How does that work?
Well, when major foreign bidders, say European or South Korean contenders looking at submarine or fighter contracts, when they bid on Canadian procurement, they are now required, legally, to include Canadian suppliers, establish local manufacturing facilities, and most crucially, transfer intellectual property.
IP transfer, that's key.
It is. This
Yeah.
isn't just about offsets anymore. It's
Yeah.
about embedding advanced foreign technology right into the Canadian industrial base. It rapidly upskills the workforce and creates proprietary national capabilities. The goal is that Canada doesn't just buy a product, it buys the ability to produce and maintain that product down the line.
And this high-tech focus extends beyond defense to civilian infrastructure. How did they manage to cut through the notoriously long approval times for mega projects? That's always a hurdle.
That's where Bill C-5 comes in. While the source text doesn't explicitly name the bill number, the policy mechanism is clearly defined, simplifying project approvals.
Right.
This bill introduced what they call a single-window regulatory application process. It means projects no longer need to navigate dozens of provincial and federal bodies sequentially, which took forever.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, it established mechanisms for accelerated environmental review and, in cases deemed of strategic national interest, federal override powers to push projects forward. This streamlined process has apparently resulted in the approval of some $60 billion in private investments covering 5 major ventures.
$60 billion, that is a serious commitment. What are some of those headline projects?
Well, they include the Darlington Small Modular Reactor Project, which is expected to employ thousands in clean energy, and also the high-speed rail line connecting Toronto and Quebec City. These projects act as massive internal stimulus. The overall goal of Pillar 2 is explicit. Building more global-sized national champions? Think like CGI in tech or Lululemon in retail companies capable of projecting influence abroad and competing globally. The source material actually refers to this as a quiet form of economic nationalism.
Quiet economic nationalism. I like that.
Yeah, not shouting about tariffs, but silently building unassailable industrial scale.
So, if the U.S. wants to use trade rules to try and isolate Canada, the response is to aggressively build these high-value, diversified supply chains that integrate Canadian companies globally, focusing on tech transfer and massive domestic projects.
Which brings us neatly to the third pillar, attract. And this is arguably the most, well, brilliant political move of the three. Canada is essentially weaponizing stability as a brand differentiator.
That contrast is powerful, isn't it? While Washington has been dealing with budget shutdowns, constant policy volatility, increased restrictions on visas, academic movement, Canada is presenting itself as the calm alternative.
Exactly. Ottawa is actively streamlining permits, reducing regulatory delays, basically rolling out the red carpet and inviting global investors to relocate their operations. And we see this messaging resonating in the financial world. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, ZPPI.
That's Canada's huge sovereign wealth fund, right?
Uh-huh.
Highly respected.
That's the one. The CPPIB recently reaffirmed that Canada remains one of the best destinations worldwide for long-term patient capital. Now, when a fund managing over $500 billion confirms that message, the world tends to pay attention.
But I have to challenge this point a little. Is Canada's stability brand, truly sufficient on its own to overcome the sheer scale advantage of the U.S. market?
Yeah.
And what about the massive incentives offered by things like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA?
That is the critical counterpoint, absolutely. Yeah. The IRA offers subsidies at a scale Canada simply cannot match dollar for dollar. That's clear.
Right.
However, what Canada offers is predictability. The sources suggest that many multinational firms are actually willing to accept slightly lower direct financial incentives in exchange for guaranteed stability and the rule of law. Think about it. If a key U.S. policy priority shifts dramatically every 4 years, potentially disrupting a decade-long capital investment plan, well, that stability premium Canada offers suddenly becomes incredibly valuable.
Predictability as a currency.
Precisely. And it's not just about money, it's also about talent. Yes.
That's Pillar 3's second prong. New programs are explicitly designed to draw international researchers, engineers, and students to Canadian innovation hubs. By countering the visa restrictions and political uncertainty seen elsewhere, Canada aims to become the default talent magnet.
So attracting brains as well as capital.
Exactly. When intellectual property and top talent can move freely and securely, long-term R&D investment tends to follow. So, bottom line, The U.S. trade aggression, which was intended to secure American dominance, instead seems to have catalyzed Canada into this fundamental industrial restructuring. It's almost a textbook case of external pressure forcing necessary internal evolution.
Okay.
So we covered copper as the big symbol of this new resilience, but we really must shift focus now to the quieter, yet perhaps more strategically potent source of Canadian leverage.
Nickel.
Nickel, okay?
Yeah.
Canada possesses these vast, stable reserves of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, and nickel sits right at that crucial intersection of stainless steel production and advanced EV battery chemistries. And as tariffs continue to reshape global supply chains, nickel seems to have moved from just being a simple commodity to becoming a powerful geopolitical bargaining chip. Let's establish Canada's weight here. The source material shows a clear increase in output recently.
Yes, Canada went from roughly 159,000 tons in 2023 to nearly 190,000 tons in 2024. And in 2023 alone, they exported about $3.2 billion CAD worth of primary nickel products. That's significant volume.
$3.2 billion. And here's the core issue for the U.S., right? Dependence.
Dependence is the word. The United States purchased nearly half of Canada's nickel exports. If you look at the data from 2020 through 2023, roughly 46% of all U.S. primary nickel imports came directly from Canada.
Wow, nearly half.
Yeah, and with U.S. apparent consumption near 84,000 tons per year and very limited domestic mining or smelting capacity, Canada isn't just a preferred supplier. It is an indispensable, essential component of U.S. heavy industry and defense supply chains. This dependency really places nickel in the same strategic category as energy resources these days.
Okay, let's explore that leverage scenario for the listener then. If Canada were to restrict this supply, even partially, how difficult and costly would it actually be for U.S. manufacturers to quickly substitute that volume?
This is where the physics and chemistry of the trade war get complicated. Substitution is extremely difficult, especially in the short term. Primary nickel, which is what Canada mainly exports, is required for specific high-performance alloys and stainless steel grades used in specialized industrial hardware, military equipment.
Right.
You can't easily replace it with secondary nickel or scrap, which has different purity levels and properties.
So if Canada did restrict the flow, what kind of immediate shortfall would the U.S. face? What are the numbers?
Well, based on current consumption and those reliance figures we mentioned, a sharp Canadian restriction could potentially create a shortfall of between 30,000 to 40,000 tons over a full year.
30 to 40,000 tons.
And while the U.S. could certainly try to tap other global sources like Indonesia or Australia, those supply chains are longer, they're more volatile, and they're often tied up in existing long-term contracts already. The price impact would likely be immediate and quite severe.
And our sources actually give us a way to calculate that pain directly, don't they?
Exactly. Using the 2024 London Metal Exchange price for nickel, which has been hovering around 17,000 US dollars per ton, a supply squeeze that raised prices by just 20 to 30%, which is plausible in that scenario, would translate to an added $290 million to $430 million in annual direct nickel costs for U.S. manufacturers.
Wow. $250 million just in direct costs.
Just direct costs, yeah. And that doesn't even account for the subsequent disruption, plant slowdowns, lost orders that inevitably result from that kind of supply uncertainty.
Where exactly does that pain hit fastest and hardest in the U.S. economy?
It really hits two primary strategic areas. First, it impacts the massive stainless steel market. Think industrial hardware, medical equipment, food processing machinery. These sectors often operate on quite thin margins, and a sudden, significant increase in feedstock cost would compress profitability very rapidly, ultimately passing that cost on to U.S. consumers and businesses.
And the second area is that high-stakes electric vehicle sector, I presume.
The EV sector is crucial, yes. While the lower-cost lithium ferrophosphate, or LFP, batteries are gaining popularity, those are the less nickel-dependent ones. Many long-range, high-performance platforms still rely heavily on nickel-manganese cobalt NMC chemistries for their higher energy density.
Right.
So a sustained bump in nickel costs would immediately slow down those planned price reductions for the higher-end EV models. It would delay consumer adoption and undermine the huge investments made by automakers, particularly in places like Michigan and Ohio.
The message then seems to be that Canada doesn't even need to actually use this leverage right now. The mere existence of this option, this dependency, strengthens their hand significantly as trade talks continue.
It demonstrates precisely why critical minerals are now such a source of bargaining power, arguably trumping tariffs on finished goods in some ways. Canada has proved it controls the essential input materials necessary for 21st century industry. In a trade war, often defined by financial duties, critical minerals like nickel become a powerful, non-tariff bargaining chip that Canada can deploy or threaten to deploy to protect its broader economic interests and secure its place in global supply chains.
Now, this intense economic maneuvering doesn't happen in a vacuum, of course. Let's shift our focus now to the domestic political drama unfolding in Ottawa, specifically inside the Parliament chamber, which our sources described as being alive with tension and even the site of a political earthquake, reflecting that ongoing cross-border confrontation.
Yeah, the tariff war created an incredibly powerful political weapon for the opposition. Every single new duty imposed by Washington, whether it was on lumber, autos, furniture, you name it, immediately became framed as proof of the government's alleged failure.
And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre really led that charge, didn't he?
Mm.
Accusing Prime Minister Mark Carney of driving the country toward economic ruin and exhibiting, quote, profound weakness abroad, basically allowing Canada to be bullied by its largest trading partner.
Poilievre's attack was, well, politically masterful because it focused on those immediate, emotionally resonant pain points. And he backed it up with specific, raw data points. He cited the loss of, I think it was 86,000 jobs since Carney took office. He claimed that $50 billion TAD in private investment had fled the country, and he warned constantly of soaring public debt, reaching $600 billion. His strategy was clear. Frame every new tariff as definitive proof of Carney's failure to protect Canadian jobs. He called it a double blow effect.
Double blow.
Yeah, Washington imposes the pain, but the Carney government gets blamed for it domestically.
What was the tone like in the chamber? Was it just, dry fiscal debate?
Yeah.
Or did the sources describe something more theatrical?
Oh, our sources describe the chamber as extremely volatile. Poilievre's approach was often highly confrontational, quite theatrical. His rhetoric frequently painted the government as detached, focused on abstract long-term plans, while ordinary Canadians were losing their jobs right now. He really leveraged that frustration, suggesting the Prime Minister was prioritizing global stature over basic kitchen table economics. The pressure was intense, and it was ongoing.
But Prime Minister Carney had to respond, obviously. How did he try to shift the focus away from those difficult job loss numbers and towards his own long-term resilience plan?
Well, Carney responded by skillfully redirecting the blame squarely south. He actually coined the phrase, "let's talk about a little thing called cause and effect." He argued consistently that the true source of Canada's economic challenges was not his government's fiscal spending, but rather the external aggression, specifically the U.S. tariffs hitting steel, lumber, and autos. He effectively positioned himself not as the cause of the storm, but as the captain trying to steer the ship through a foreign-generated hurricane.
And he backed up his long-term defense with structural data, which is often harder to attack quickly in that kind of soundbite-driven environment.
Exactly. Carney countered the narrative of economic collapse by citing Canada's strong underlying economic fundamentals. He repeatedly pointed to Canada's AAA credit rating from both S&P and Moody's, proving that global financial confidence remained high despite the tariffs.
Right.
He highlighted that Canada maintained the lowest deficit and debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7. And crucially, he pointed out that long-term interest rates in Canada were actually lower than those in the U.S., indicating market calm despite all the political turmoil. The argument was, fundamentally, Canada is stable, the pain is purely external, imposed from outside.
What's fascinating here, if we connect this political drama back to the wider economic impact, is the analysis of the U.S. self-inflicted wound. While Poilievre was, raising hell in Ottawa over lost Canadian jobs, the U.S. tariff strategy was rapidly backfiring in the very industries it was supposed to protect back home in America.
The costs started mounting surprisingly quickly, revealing the true economic illiteracy of aggressive protectionism sometimes. By the late summer of 2025, U.S. construction firms were publicly reporting skyrocketing lumber costs directly attributable to the duties. Furniture retailers faced massively higher import bills. Even automakers in Michigan and Ohio, the supposed beneficiaries, actually slowed production because the cost of those expensive, tariff-laden cross-border parts raised their overall operating costs significantly. The pain was being distributed, not contained as intended.
And those costs translated directly to U.S. consumers eventually, right? Hitting wallets.
Absolutely. Consumer groups were sounding the alarm bells quite loudly by the fall of 2025. They warned that these tariffs were acting like hidden taxes on U.S. households, fueling widespread inflation and eroding real wages.
So the irony is pretty stark.
It is. The policies meant to boost U.S. manufacturing were actively undermining U.S. consumer purchasing power. Furthermore, globally, you had allies starting to question the commitment of the U.S. to the WTO system. And the isolation worsened when China's retaliation, for instance, on Canadian canola and seafood, compounded uncertainty for U.S. agriculture, too, adding losses on the American side as well.
So for every political point Poiriev scored in Ottawa citing job losses, American industries and consumers were paying a tangible price that arguably destabilized the U.S. economic recovery itself. Suddenly, Carney's long-term vision, focused on resilience and diversification, started to look less like a political talking point and more like, well, the only sensible path forward.
That really is the ultimate takeaway from this political chapter, I think. Carney highlighted, for instance, that Ontario cobalt sulfate refinery project we touched on, designed to produce enough cobalt for 1 million EVs annually. That project isn't just about jobs. It's fundamentally about reducing Canada's vulnerability to future tariff shocks by securing more of the value chain at home. The clash in Parliament, while intense, ultimately showed that Canada would not be politically or economically subordinate anymore. The aggression simply accelerated their push for independence. Hashtag outro.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, seeking a clear view of this complex economic confrontation? Our deep dive into these sources reveals that the economic aggression, initially intended to secure U.S. dominance, seems to have provided Canada with the critical challenge it perhaps needed. It arguably forced Ottawa to abandon its long-held status as the quiet neighbor and actively start building a more self-reliant industrial future one, rooted in technology, clean energy, and importantly, diversified global partnerships.
And the confirmation of that backfire mechanism is really profound. American tariffs were meant to provide leverage, but that leverage appears to weaken daily as Canada successfully diversifies its markets and builds strategic domestic capacity, like we saw with McIlvenna Bay.
Right.
Meanwhile, the U.S. seems to be shouldering higher import costs, dealing with higher inflation and grappling with policy volatility, while Canada is, to some extent, cashing in on the brand of stability and reliable resource supply that it has carefully cultivated through this period.
Canada is charting its next industrial chapter, as the sources suggest. Ship by ship, job by job, policy by policy.
Yeah.
We've seen the pain cited by the opposition in Ottawa, definitely a real pain. But we've also seen the rising costs reported by U.S. consumer groups and industries.
Yeah, the costs are mounting on both sides for different reasons.
Exactly. So, given those mounting costs reported on both sides, the critical question, maybe for you to explore further, is this. Which country's long-term economic model protectionism and a degree of isolation or resilience built on diversification and stability is truly sustainable and better positioned for global success in our volatile 21st century?
That question, I think, will likely define the next decade, maybe more, of North American economic history.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.